Today we're looking at what seems to be the final word, federally speaking, on a really massive and frankly disturbing legal case.
That's right. We're talking about the Alex Jones defamation judgment, specifically the one connected to his claims about the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting back in 2012.
Yeah, a truly awful situation. So we've gathered the sources, court documents, legal commentary, news reports, and our mission today for you listening is pretty straightforward. We want to unpack what the Supreme Court actually decided, or rather didn't decide, and clarify these just astronomical financial numbers involved, but maybe most importantly explain the specific legal path that led here. It wasn't exactly a standard trial outcome.
Right. That's key. Why didn't Jones get what most people think of as his day in court on the substance, and why did the Supreme Court basically say that's okay?
So let's start with the top line finding. What did the Supreme Court actually do here?
Well, fundamentally, they declined to hear Alex Jones's appeal.
Yeah.
Simple as that. They issued the decision without any comment, which isn't unusual for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But the effect is huge.
Yeah.
It means the massive multi-billion-dollar judgment against him from the Connecticut court. That stands.
It's final at the federal level.
Exactly. It effectively shuts the door on any further federal appeals in this particular case. For the families, legally, this verdict is now cemented.
Okay, let's rewind a bit then to really get the scale of this. Remind us, what was the core claim Jones was making? The lie at the heart of it all.
It was truly vile. Jones claimed repeatedly for years on his platform Infowars that the Sandy Hook shooting, where 20 little kids, first graders, and 6 educators were murdered, he claimed it was all fake.
A hoax.
A total hoax, yeah. He said it was staged using crisis actors, all part of some elaborate plot to push for more gun control. And this wasn't just talk. His rhetoric directly led to years of horrific harassment, death threats, people confronting these grieving families. Just unimaginable cruelty fueled by these lies.
And the people who sued him in Connecticut, they were the direct targets of this.
Absolutely. The plaintiffs were primarily the families of the victims. But importantly, an FBI agent who responded to the shooting was also part of the suit.
Someone who saw the reality firsthand.
Exactly. Someone who was there, saw the absolute horror of that day, which Jones is calling fake. Their involvement really underscored the reality Jones denied.
Okay, let's talk about the money, because the number is just staggering. Around $1.4 billion. That wasn't just one lump sum decided at one moment, right? It had two parts.
That's right. It's crucial to break that down. There are two types of damages here. First, you have compensatory damages.
Okay, what are those for?
Compensatory is meant to, well, compensate the victims for the actual harm they suffered. Think emotional distress, damage to their reputation, security costs because of the harassment, that kind of thing. In Connecticut, the jury awarded almost $965 million for that, nearly $1 billion, just to try and make the victors whole for their suffering.
It's just staggering. Okay, so that's almost $1 billion. How did we get to the $1.4 billion total?
That's the second part. Punitive damages. These aren't about paying back the victims for losses.
They're about punishment.
Exactly.
Sure.
They're meant to punish the defendant Jones, in this case, for truly outrageous conduct, and importantly, to deter him and anyone else from doing something similar ever again. So after the jury awarded the compensatory damages, the judge stepped in and added another $473 million purely as punitive damages.
Wow.
Basically saying his actions were so malicious, so harmful that this extra financial penalty was necessary. Add those two together, and you land at roughly that $1.4 billion figure.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really fascinating from a legal process standpoint. Jones's big argument to the Supreme Court was that he didn't get a fair trial, that his rights were violated. But how did the case even get to a point where there's $1 billion judgment without a full trial on whether his claims were actually defamatory? That seems like the core issue was skipped.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But this is the absolute crux of why the Supreme Court likely didn't take the case. His argument about free speech or a fair trial on the merits of his speech kind of missed the point of why he lost so badly beforehand.
Okay.
The reason the massive judgment happened wasn't because a jury heard all the evidence about his Sandy Hook claims and then decided. It was because of something called a default ruling.
A default ruling. Okay, what does that mean in plain English? And what did Jones do to trigger it?
Think of it like this. When you're sued, there's a process called discovery. Both sides have to share evidence, documents, answer questions under oath. It's fundamental to the process. You have to show your cards, basically.
The evidence gathering stage.
Exactly. And Jones and his legal team, according to the court, just didn't. They repeatedly ignored court orders to turn over evidence, financial records, website analytics, things the families needed to prove their case. They delayed, they obstructed, they just didn't comply over and over again.
So the judge got fed up.
Profoundly fed up. The judge essentially determined that Jones was acting in bad faith, that he was deliberately stonewalling the whole process. So a default ruling is the court's ultimate sanction. It's the judge saying, you have refused to participate in this process according to the rules. You've shown contempt for the court's orders. Therefore, I am ruling against you on the question of liability by default. He was found legally responsible, not necessarily because the judge ruled on the truth of his speech then and there.
But because he refused to play by the court's rules.
Precisely. His refusal to cooperate was, in effect, treated as an admission that he didn't have a valid defense on the liability question. The damages were assessed later, but the core finding of liability, that was locked in because of his conduct during the lawsuit.
So when the Supreme Court justices just issued their denial without comment, they were essentially upholding the lower court's power to enforce its own procedures against someone acting like that.
That's how most legal analysts are reading it. It wasn't really about the First Amendment claims Jones was making in his appeal. It was about judicial authority. The message seems to be courts have the power and the obligation to control their own proceedings. You can't just ignore orders and expect the process to wait for you. It really highlights this growing intolerance, you could say, for defendants who try to use the legal system while simultaneously defying its rules, especially in cases involving misinformation and real-world harm. There has to be accountability within the process itself.
Okay, so the legal finding is locked. Federal appeals are done for this Connecticut case. But then there's the massive elephant in the room, actually collecting $1.4 billion. That's where bankruptcy comes in, right?
Exactly. This is where the fight shifts dramatically. Jones and his main company, Free Speech Systems, which runs Infowars, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
Which complicates things a lot.
Hugely. So while the families have this legally finalized judgment saying they're owed this vast sum, actually getting it is another story. Jones's lawyers basically argue, look, he doesn't have $1.4 billion. His assets, while maybe substantial, they claim, don't come anywhere close to covering that amount. So the bankruptcy process is now about figuring out what assets there are and how they get distributed.
And it's probably worth reminding listeners quickly, this huge Connecticut judgment, this is separate from another defamation case he lost, right, in Texas?
Yes, good point. There was a separate trial in Texas with different plaintiffs related to the same Sandy Hook lies. That resulted in a verdict of about $49 million.
Okay.
Jones is still appealing that one. But the Connecticut case, because of the sheer size of the judgment and now the Supreme Court's refusal to intervene, that's really the main event financially.
Right. And speaking of finances and assets, the attempts to deal with Infowars itself through the bankruptcy court have been, well, frankly, bizarre.
Oh, completely. Trying to liquidate Infowars, sell it off to pay the Sandy Hook families has been incredibly messy.
There was that whole thing with the Onion, wasn't there?
Yes. That was peak legal absurdity.
Yeah.
At one point, there was a proposal, or at least a publicized interest, from the parent company of the satirical website, The Onion, potentially bidding to buy Infowars in the bankruptcy auction.
Wait, seriously? Like, the comedy site wanted to buy Alex Jones's platform?
That was the situation being discussed. It was surreal. Imagine the headlines.
I can't even. Predictably, the bankruptcy judge overseeing things quickly invalidated that specific auction attempt. The judge basically said, you know, this needs to be a serious process aimed at maximizing real value for the victims, not whatever that was.
Not a performance art piece.
Right. So that particular weirdness ended. And the whole complex case of sorting out his assets and the company's future eventually got moved out of federal bankruptcy court and into a Texas state court. That's where the slow, grinding work of trying to actually liquidate assets is happening now. Okay, so let's move to the final piece here. We have this legal finality from the Supreme Court, this huge debt hanging over him, the bankruptcy chaos. But then there's the public Jones, the one still on the air. And we have to be impartial here, just reporting what's happening. But he hasn't exactly stopped broadcasting or changed his tune, has he?
No, not at all. That's the stark contrast. Jones continues to broadcast on Infowars.
Yeah.
And he uses the entire legal process, this massive judgment, the bankruptcy.
Content.
This content, exactly. He consistently frames it to his audience as a politically motivated attack, a deep state conspiracy, what he calls an assault on free speech. He paints himself as the victim here.
So the legal system delivers this definitive, massive judgment based on his actions and his
All
lies.
right.
But the platform that spread the lies and the narrative of persecution that fuels it, that continues while the victims are still fighting through the courts just to get paid.
That's the difficult reality. The Supreme Court's refusal confirms the legal fact. He's liable. The debt is real. The federal legal fight on liability is over. Full stop. But his ability to continue broadcasting, to frame the narrative for his followers, and to use the bankruptcy system potentially to delay or minimize payments, that creates this ongoing tension. The legal truth is set, but the practical consequences are still unfolding very slowly and contentiously in state court.
So wrapping this up, the key takeaway for you, the listener, seems clear. The courts have sent a message. This kind of conduct, spreading dangerous lies that cause immense harm and then completely defying court orders during the legal process, it comes with an almost unimaginable price tag.
An unprecedented price tag. It confirms that there are limits, even considering free speech arguments, when speech is defamatory, causes severe harm, and the speaker then obstructs the justice system itself.
Behavior this extreme has consequences.
Massive ones. But, that leads to maybe a final thought to leave people with. The legal system established liability. That's done. The Supreme Court cemented it. But these ongoing struggles, the bankruptcy complexities, the fight to actually liquidate a media entity like Infowars and turn that judgment into actual dollars for the families,
Yeah.
it raises a really tough question, doesn't it?
It just
What happens when these enormous, legally sound judgments meet the practical limits of bankruptcy law and, maybe more pointedly, the continued operation of the very media platform that caused the harm in the first place? The law delivered a verdict, but can the mechanisms of the law fully enforce that verdict against an entity seemingly designed to operate through defiance? That's the battle still being fought.